Recording.
Great. Thanks, Naveed. Thanks, everyone, for joining. So today's topic is Azure Stack. I'll go ahead and get started here. So my name is Nathan Reynolds. I'm an Azure Infrastructure Technical Specialist, which is a mouthful. I joined Microsoft in 2015. Previously, I've worked in operations, so networking and server operations, as well as consulting. And during that time, about 10 years of experience as an independent network security auditor. So since joining Microsoft, most of my work has been involved in helping customers adopt Azure and sort of map to that internally, as well as data center modernization, implementing management at scale, and specific to Azure Stack, I've been involved in kind of understanding Azure Stack since the early technical preview. So it's amazing to see how far it's come and sort of the energy and momentum behind Azure Stack. So usually when talking about Azure Stack, so today's session agenda, we'll kind of get right into it with Azure Stack. Exciting to see, again, the momentum and energy behind Azure Stack. Usually the early part of that conversation is sort of setting expectations. Customers are excited about it. There's typically some questions about how do I get started having all of these Azure services in my data center. I don't know anything about Azure, but just help me roll it out. So we like to take a few steps back and kind of get started with those customers and explaining sort of what Azure Stack is. And I like to start out that conversation by kind of explaining some basics about a cloud platform. If you're joining a session called Azure Power Lunch, you've probably already seen something like this or know these things. But just to get started and kind of define Azure Stack and what it is. So any cloud is sort of made up of these four basic components. We have end user experiences, how you interact with it. A cloud application model, so what defines the services and what are the relationship between the services. Including the infrastructure services and platform services themselves, and then some sort of cloud infrastructure that those services run on. So usually software-defined solutions, software-defined networking, software-defined storage, and some compute offerings of various types. So with Azure, we take that model. How we implement that model is by using, of course, the Azure portal, PowerShell and DevOps tools to interact with the Azure Resource Manager, which is our cloud model. The Resource Manager surfaces those IaaS and PaaS offerings that sit on top of our cloud infrastructure that we have across our global data center network. So with Azure Stack, we implement that in much the same way. It is the same portal, it is the same PowerShell, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the same DevOps tools. That also leverages Azure Resource Manager, so it's the same implementation model of those services and how you interact with those services. Now, when it comes to the services themselves, for the compute options, it's mostly the same. For PaaS options, we have a very targeted, very specific set of PaaS options that we offer. So those things are things like application service, service fabric. We'll get into kind of the differences there. Really what those things are there to do is make sure that we have consistent operations, consistent offering, and then the infrastructure itself is cloud-inspired infrastructure. Obviously, it's not the same infrastructure because it's a completely different scale model. But this cloud-inspired infrastructure from our OEM partners, and I'll also sort of talk about that here in a minute. So again, as I mentioned, there's usually a lot of excitement, a lot of energy around Azure Stack and sort of helping a customer understand where it fits in their data center and their operations is key. So let's talk about what Azure Stack is and what it isn't. So let's clearly define this. Azure Stack is Microsoft's hybrid cloud platform. So it is just that. It is Azure. Again, being involved since the early technical previews, being involved in some of the innards of Azure Stack, I can testify to the fact that that is Azure. It is a kind of a slightly miniaturized, slightly peeled back and self-contained version of the Azure platform. And that means a couple of different things. So what that isn't is a virtualization replacement play, or I would even say a public cloud replacement play. I'm not going to take everything that I have in my data center, all of my virtual machines or things today running on physical machines, and cram them into a hybrid cloud platform, because very likely many of those virtual machines simply don't fit within a cloud model. If you're running some sort of virtualization infrastructure today, you're likely to continue to, even if you fully adopt Azure Stack. That may be drastically reduced, but these are things, again, we think about Azure Stack as an extension of Azure, and we have to treat it as such. Likewise, it's not a cloud replacement play, and I'll talk a little bit about that with this next discussion. So Azure Stack is offered as an integrated system. So again, I mentioned some of our OEM partners, and I'll talk about them on our next slide. What it is not is some sort of DIY project. This is very intentionally offered on specific validated cloud hardware. So from those partners, and we do that to make sure that we have, again, it's offered as Azure. We need to make sure that it has certain availability concepts. It has certain stability and support, available to our customers. It's not something that I'm going to, cobble together with off-the-shelf parts and try to shoehorn a fabric on that. Actually, building your own cloud, in my experience in working with enterprise customers, is not cheap, and it's not easy. Even with Microsoft's own cloud solution hardware, if you're using ours or competitors, building those things by yourself is difficult. Most customers may say they have some sort of private cloud. In my experience, even very large enterprises are using mostly virtualization. There's a lot of operational components that go into actually building that cloud, and we need to make sure that those operational components are consistent across the on-premises experience and the public experience. So that's I cannot emphasize enough how much work has gone into really making sure that we're delivering consistent Azure services on-prem as well, and that means that we have to offer that as an integrated system. In kind of the same vein, any kind of Azure offering, Azure service, as well as the underlying Azure platform itself running on Azure Stack is regularly updated. We have to make sure that we are continuing along this cloud cadence, making sure that as services get offered, as we have updates to the Azure Fabric itself, and recently there's with some of the Intel vulnerabilities going around that kind of highlights our need for making sure that not only is our cloud experience consistent, but it's also secure, and making sure that we do have some way to address those platform issues as they come up, and as well as drive some of the innovations, things like that we're building on top of Azure. So, on that note, it is not a static system that you deploy and forget. It's not a virtualization infrastructure that you stand up in a room and you run whatever the current version of Windows Server is when you do it, and run that for the next 10 years without zero changes. Now, we have made the actual update process for Azure Stack. It's very streamlined. It's all bundled in with the underlying hardware, and we do work very hard with the OEM partners and testing and making sure that all of those updates are delivered in a timely fashion, but also that they've been rigorously tested when they arrive at the customer data center, so that you have the latest and greatest, but it's also something that operationally you should feel comfortable operating those components on something that does get updated. It's not a dreaded update process. It shouldn't be something that you're afraid to sort of patch because it's unstable. It's very streamlined, and on that note, you should feel comfortable doing it. What it is, again, it is truly open and flexible. It is just like Azure. This is not a Microsoft only thing. We built the same platform. We reuse the same platform components, just like we do on Azure, delivering the Azure public cloud. So on that note, there are open source services. There are third-party virtual appliances, things like that. We'll get into some of those offerings. So again, I mentioned some of the integrated delivery experience. So diving into that, because that's where, when we get into the weeds with a customer and talking about Azure Stack, that's where a lot of the questions come up in terms of cost modeling, in terms of really understanding how this thing fits into their cloud and data center picture. So first things first, as I mentioned, Azure Stack is offered as an integrated system. So we have some great partners in this space, Dell EMC, HPE, Lenovo, Cisco, Huawei, and Wortmann AG, who's a German hardware manufacturer. Also not on this list, but kind of a late announcement was Avanade offering its own systems. So the goal there when offering Azure Stack on these systems is to have a quick, again, reach that fast time to deployment. Being able to quickly deliver a cloud value to a customer's data center for the services that should run, in a cloud environment, but for some reason cannot. And I'll dive a little bit into the other reasons in a moment. So the fast time to deploy, again, when you compare it to other clouds, private cloud offerings, whether they be from Microsoft or a competitor, they are typically a project. There's a lot of effort involved in building and maturing and maintaining those private cloud offerings. So what we aim to do is to be able to essentially drop an integrated system with Azure Stack into a customer data center sized for the workload that should be running on that stack. And that can grow over time, so we can scale those units. We can also offer those units in multiple customer data center locations. So if a customer has a global presence or even a national presence with multiple data centers, we want to make sure we have a point of presence there for that particular application running on Azure Stack. So we do have similar availability models to what you might find for the Azure public cloud. So the pay-as-you-use model, this also gets a lot of questions because it's your hardware running in your data center. Why would you pay Microsoft to use it? Well, again, you're sort of using the same Azure features and functionality. Obviously, those come at a much cheaper rate since you're not renting our storage or networking or compute capabilities. You're actually owning those things. But there is sort of a pay-as-you-use model, just like you would for any virtualization platform. So some of those meters and things are available in one of the resources at the end of this presentation. Also is, I mentioned support, some of the support experiences. That's absolutely critical in making sure that you can actually maintain and operate this platform. So we have both embedded Microsoft resources with our OEM partners and vice versa in testing and validation. So we want customers to have a consistent support experience. And with both Azure Stack and Azure, if you have a Microsoft support agreement today, that's the same way that support will be delivered to you. And that support is available in 46 geographies, generally similar to what you find with other global support and Azure systems. So now let's talk a little bit about the services on Azure Stack. As I mentioned, we do offer IaaS. You'll see a lot of IaaS services here. Virtual machines, including VM scale sets and virtual appliances, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the virtual appliance offerings here from our partners. Really, again, when you want to kind of differentiate the things running on a virtualization platform to what belongs on a truly cloud platform like Azure Stack. So basically, when we talk about workloads, the right thing to think about Azure Stack is those things that you would put in a public cloud, but for some reason you can't. And cost is not one of those. It is always going to be a more expensive proposition to run something on premises just because of the economics of scale, and Azure Stack is no different. But if I have certain possibly regulatory compliance, or I need to have my Azure cloud services in a location that isn't serviced by a public or even a hosted environment that runs the Azure platform, I can offer that via Azure Stack. So some of the other services that we have offered are the Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Service Fabric, so more of our application environments and serverless compute, as well as containers and container orchestration. And of course, we have the same software-defined networking and software-defined storage stacks as we have on Azure Public, as well as Key Vault, so all of the storage of those securables and application keys and secrets. as well as in this case Pivotal and other open source frameworks that have kind of built hooks into the Azure platform. Those are also offered on Azure Stack as well. So when we talk about our ecosystem for Azure Stack, that ecosystem is very much one and the same as Azure Public. So there are some discrepancies. We do have lists of basically which of our partners do have Azure Stack offerings, but really those offerings are one and the same, and I'll prove it to you here in a moment. But essentially, all these vendors have done is said, yes, I have validated my configuration to run on Azure Stack. I want it to run on Azure Stack, and really delivering that virtual appliance on Azure Stack is really via a syndicated model. I'm accessing the same marketplace. I'm synchronizing the offers from that Azure marketplace that I want available on Azure Stack, and then I'm simply making those available. So if I've got a virtual appliance, if I have a open source, an open source operating system or distribution or something similar that I want running that is available in Azure Public, or if I have an image that possibly I've built for Azure Public and want to implement my own images in my own offerings, that's again something that can be done on Azure Stack as well. It's just a matter of uploading that image or uploading that VHD, registering it as available image, very similar to what you would do in Azure Public. So now we'll talk a little bit about some of the automation and orchestration models, and this was actually really fun playing around with in the early technical preview, because I had the question, I had my own personal doubts. Is this thing really Azure? What is Microsoft, what is engineering doing? How similar is this thing, and is this all just marketing, or is this thing really Azure? So I think the first evidence there is with PowerShell. Again, there is a registration process for adding essentially an Azure Stack endpoint, but I've actually listed some of those endpoints there for Azure Public and an Azure Stack environment, and I've highlighted the differences. So you have a different Active Directory service endpoint that is registered to your Azure Active Directory tenant. You have a different resource manager URL that is associated with the endpoints, the URL that surfaced on your network, and the storage endpoint is also the Azure storage endpoints that are registered from Azure Stack, so registered on your network. The commands are exactly the same. There are no differences, no changes, things like that. If I want to get Azure RMVM from Azure Public, I can do the same thing via Azure Stack. The only difference is I'm changing the target environment that I'm actually running against. So if I've got scripts or templates or other things like that that I have built for Azure Public, if I've got orchestrations, things that help me run my services, implementing those on Azure Stack could not be easier. Another test that I did to kind of understand how similar is this thing is take basically one of the third-party storage explorers for Azure, and I basically did some DNS hacks on my local machine to basically fool that thing into thinking that, hey, Azure, when it was trying to talk to Azure, it was really talking to Azure Stack, and my experience on that was exactly the same. That was pretty cool. Actually seeing a third-party product that had no knowledge, and they've since updated it to formally support Azure Stack for that particular product, but to take something that had no knowledge of Azure Stack and fool it to thinking that Azure Stack was Azure and see it work exactly the same. I was able to create containers, copy content, everything else like that, because again, it is Azure. So now we'll reach the resources, and I'll discuss some of the resources a little bit, but I did, before we get into Q&A, I want to show a little bit of a demo. So I actually have a running Azure Stack environment. So this is something that I'm not going to show what the Azure Stack user experience is, because if you've seen Azure, you've seen the Azure Stack user experience. It is exactly the same. Really what I want to talk about is some of the ways that we offer an administrative experience. So this is some of the stuff that Microsoft handles when you're an Azure customer that you would be kind of administering and maintaining and offering to the cloud consumers within your enterprise. So first of all, we have region management. So that's the same thing you might expect when building an Azure region, is that I have a local region, and this is using the Azure Stack development kit, which is available for download. It does have some very specific hardware requirements, so I recommend reviewing those if there's an interest. But yes, you can implement in a test environment Azure Stack on premises without before you invest in a hardware appliance. And then essentially there are these constructs called plans and offers. So a plan is, again, exactly what you sign up for when you register your account, when you register your credit card with Azure or via an Azure Enterprise Agreement. You're really signing up for a plan. So that plan is basically a set of Azure services paired with quotas. Again, we have some default quotas for every Azure subscription, but really you can specify your own quotas based upon your consumers' needs for that particular plan. An offer is really just taking a plan and offering it to a subset of users. So really that's how users interact with plans, is basically they're signing up for a plan via an offer. Those are both very simple constructs, so I won't really go into those. I did want to show some of the regional management. So again, you can see the infrastructure roles, all the various things that are running here behind the scenes, as well as the ability to update the Azure Stack system. So I can see as updates are available, what versions they are, my ability to apply those sorts of things. And then I can get into the individual units here in terms of my infrastructure configuration, my scale units, my virtual networks that have been created by tenants, those types of things. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get into a lot of those details. One of the things that I did mention was some of the marketplace syndication and some of the other things that we have available from that. So if I look at my Azure Marketplace, again, these are the things that kind of come default out of the box with Azure Stack. So you can see that I can create virtual network connections, load balancers. I've got all the same things for IaaS that I might have to offer IaaS services, as well as availability sets, scale sets, those types of things. So the two discrepancies there would be the fact that I've got Ubuntu Server 1604 and I've also got Windows Server 2016 Data Center. Those images actually came from the Azure Marketplace. So to show you how I actually syndicate those, really it's just a matter of registering your Azure Stack environment with the Azure environment, so it can actually draw down those resources. But once I've done that, I can actually see my marketplace management, and these are the things that I'm really syndicating from the Azure Marketplace and making available to my customers. And again, if I want to add things from Azure, again, I can register my own images, but if I want to add these things from Azure, it's going to go out, it's going to query the Azure Marketplace, and you can see all of the images and virtual appliances that have been made available for Azure Stack. So plenty of offerings here with regards to Microsoft and open source. We've got a great partnership with Bitnami, continues on Azure Stack, so you can see all of the open source Bitnami images, as well as some virtual appliances from Kemp, Hortonworks, Chef, Checkpoint, plenty of others. Good stuff there. So now I'm going to turn it back over to the resources. So I put two resources here, and we can work on disseminating those. So we've got pretty good material on Azure Stack and sort of what it is, and as well as some use cases, overviews. And then we also have a really great white paper that helps answer some of those questions that a lot of our customers have. And it's called Azure Stack, an extension of Azure. But that really dives into the details of some of the operational and cost models, as well as support, and really what you should be thinking about when considering Azure Stack. So that's it for the presentation. I can turn it over to Q&A.
You can post questions in the IM window, or please feel free to unmute and ask.
Well, maybe we don't have any questions. Oh, yes, Pete.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. You mentioned folks might want to use this for regulatory or other types of situations.
Mm-hmm.
What is the good answer if we have somebody that has a more isolated environment where they might have, more strict firewalls, something, or even completely isolated? Would it still be a good play there, or is it something where they would need some sort of connection out, and what type?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, Azure Stack is isolated or disconnected environments. Azure Stack is a great answer for those, and we actually have Azure Stack running on things like cruise ships and oil rigs and airplanes and things where I need to offer some cloud-like services, but maybe I have very low bandwidth environments or completely isolated or disconnected environments where the idea of offering a public cloud is, almost impossible. So yeah, there's a lot of disconnected use case scenarios for Azure Stack. So looking at the IAM windows, so in terms of authentication, does Azure Stack use Azure AD and ADFS? The answer there is yes. We have two authentication models. If I'm leveraging the Azure AD model, which is typically recommended, that's typically where I see a lot of customers going. That relies on Azure AD for role-based access controls, things like that. It's the same experience that you see in Azure Public. However, I can leverage ADFS for, again, disconnected models or things that maybe Azure AD isn't appropriate for, or there's no existing Azure AD footprint. Maybe there's good reasons that the customer isn't using that. Another question here, is there a good source to learn more about the pricing model? My recommendation there would be to probably reach out to either the specific OEMs that you're looking at potentially partnering with for Azure Stack. They're going to have a lot more information on the specifics of the hardware offerings, because that is at the heart of Azure Stack. There is a pay-as-you-use model for Azure Stack. There's also, from a Microsoft cost model perspective, there's the ability for me to do a capacity model where that's essentially I pay for the entire capacity of the Azure Stack system. But the majority of that cost is going to be from the hardware and support itself. So that's where I would recommend, if you really want to know more about the cost model. The white paper that I recommended does go into some pretty specific detail. But again, if you're looking for hard figures, talk to those OEMs. So great. Any other questions?
Okay. So we are almost at the hour, 30 minutes mark. So thank you, Nathan, for presenting. Great session. And if you have any questions, please send us the email alias, Azure Power Lunch, and we'll be happy to address those. And this session will be uploaded into Channel 9 and YouTube for later viewing. So happy Friday, everyone, and great weekend. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.